In a city veiled in mist and murmurs, a disgraced young widow steps from a hired carriage, cloaked in black and silence. Sold by the very family that should have sheltered her, Helena Marwood wears mourning like armor, until a stranger's gaze cuts through the fog. One look and duty begins to splinter. One whisper, and the past claws back with a secret ready to burn. Is she the scandal they named her, or the spark that will set an empire's rules alight? Tonight, destiny waits between shame and desire. Tell us where you're listening from and answer this. What do you love most about period romances? Slow-burn glances, forbidden vows, or triumph against society? Bath, England. The year of our Lord, 1812. The fog rolled in low across the cobbled streets like a veil of old sorrow, as if the city itself conspired to keep secrets behind every flickering lamp and cold iron gate. The air was damp, touched by the mineral breath of the thermal springs and the rustle of carriages passing like ghosts through the early morning quiet. Lady Helena Marwood stepped down from the modest hackney carriage that had brought her from the edge of the city. She did not look up at the limestone facade of the lodging house on Pulteney Street, nor did she glance at the curious eyes of the maid who held the door. Her gaze remained fixed on the uneven stones beneath her boots, as though to acknowledge the world around her might somehow fracture the fragile dignity she carried. Dressed in deepest mourning, Helena appeared as a wraith in bombazine and black wool. Her Spencer jacket was plain, the hem weighted for modesty. A netted veil draped over her bonnet, obscuring the delicate lines of her pale face and the shadow of her expression. Only the glint of a locket, worn not for love, but duty, gave any hint of the life she had once lived. At 24, she was already marked by grief not of her choosing. Her late husband, the Viscount Marwood, had died suddenly from a fever in London's filth-ridden air. Yet it was not widowhood that had exiled her. It was the swift betrayal that followed. The Dowager Lady Marwood, cold as slate and twice as sharp, had wasted no time in casting Helena from the family estate. Childless, useless, and, so said the whispered accusation, barren, Helena was quietly disposed of like an unsatisfactory servant. A transaction was made, debts were erased, and Helena was delivered not to prison, but to poverty gilded by shame. She had been sold. Not to a man, not exactly, but to silence, to obscurity. And so she found herself here, not in a grand townhouse nor a country estate, but in a narrow rented room in a widow's lodging house, where the carpets were thin and the tea weak but hot. Mrs. Agatha Plumwell, the landlady, was a woman of soft voice and brisk hands, who neither pried nor pitied. In her presence, Helena found a strange comfort, the absence of judgment. Helena unpacked her single trunk with care. Her gowns were few, all black. Her gloves were mended. Her books were mostly gone. She placed the silver hairbrush, one of the few items the Dowager had not claimed, upon the windowsill and stared out at the rising steam from the baths below. There was something ancient in the water's sigh, something that murmured of forgotten strength. On her second morning in Bath, Helena took a walk just after dawn. The mists clung to the earth like mourning veils, and her steps echoed along the crescent walk, in rhythm with her thoughts. She passed no one, save for a milk boy and an old man sweeping dust from his doorstep, until she reached the garden promenade near Sydney Place. There, she sensed it, a presence. She paused beside the iron railing, her gloved fingers brushing against the damp metal. Her breath, white in the cold air, slowed as she turned her head, just enough to see him. A tall gentleman stood beneath the skeletal arms of a winter elm, dressed in a long, dark coat of fine wool, a top hat shadowing his face. He stood quite still, hands behind his back, as though he had been watching the world rather than participating in it. And yet, Helena felt unmistakably that she was the object of his attention. She did not flinch. Her spine straightened beneath the weight of her coat, her chin lifted an inch. She did not meet his eyes, she could not see them clearly, but she felt their reach. Something passed between them then, not recognition, but awareness. He made no move toward her, nor she toward him. A few heartbeats later, Helena turned and continued her walk. But her breath was no longer even, and beneath her glove, her hand trembled ever so slightly. She would not look back. Yet behind her, the gentleman remained, gaze fixed upon the disappearing line of her figure in the mist. And when she vanished beyond the hedges, he finally exhaled, slow, thoughtful, drawn. That morning, Bath awakened not just to fog and quiet footsteps, but to the first stirrings of a story yet untold. A prince had noticed a fallen woman, not for her scandal nor her past, but for something far more dangerous: her silence, her grace, her refusal to be broken. And though Helena did not yet know it, her life, so recently bartered away, had just been seen, truly seen, for the very first time. The pump room glittered with the muted elegance of morning ritual. Sunlight filtered through tall, arched windows, casting a golden hue upon the pale stone walls and polished marble floors. Beneath the coffered ceiling, society moved like a living tapestry. Ladies in pastel muslins, gentlemen in finely tailored coats, elderly dowagers seated in quiet judgment, and hopeful mothers casting sidelong glances at every unattached man of means. The scent of lavender water, warm bread, and mineral steam lingered in the air like a whispered promise. Lady Helena Marwood stood at the edge of this world, a dark silhouette amid the cream and blush of fashion. She had come not to be seen, but to observe, drawn by the familiar echo of running water and the quiet civility of the place. Her mourning attire made her nearly invisible to those who chose not to see, yet she felt the tension in the air shift, subtly, as if her presence pulled at a thread no one remembered weaving. She moved slowly, her gloved fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup filled with warm, acrid spring water. The taste had not changed since her last visit, back when her name still held currency and her smile had not been buried beneath layers of self-protection. She sipped without reaction, then lifted her gaze, and there he stood, the man from the promenade. He was nearer now, only a few paces across the room, speaking quietly with a grey-haired gentleman who bore the crests of some foreign court on his lapel. Tall and composed, he wore a coat of navy blue wool that fit him with effortless grace, the silver embroidery along his collar glinting softly in the light. His cravat was snowy white, fastened with a sapphire pin, and his boots were shined to a mirror gleam. But it was not his attire that unsettled Helena, it was the way he looked at her. Not as others had, curious or scandalized, pitying or disdainful. He looked as if he saw something rare, something valuable, something whole. Their eyes met, steel blue and storm grey, and for the briefest moment the rest of the room seemed to fall away. Helena's breath caught in her throat. The cup in her hand felt suddenly too fragile, too warm. He did not smile. He simply inclined his head in silent greeting, as one might do to an equal. And then, as if by some unspoken cue, he moved toward her. She stiffened. "Lady Marwood," he said, his voice low and polished, touched with the faintest accent that hinted at the continent, but refused to betray any particular origin. Helena did not answer at once. Few men had addressed her by that title in many months, and fewer still with such calm assurance. "Yes," she replied at last, her voice quiet but steady. "Though I do not believe I have the honor—" "Forgive me," he said, offering a half bow. "I am Leopold of Hesse." The name struck like a chord too sharply played. Whispers of him had floated through every drawing room, from London to Brighton, the elusive prince, heir to a distant throne, visiting England on diplomatic pretense. Unmarried, untouched by scandal, desired by all. Helena's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I have heard of you, Your Highness." His gaze held hers. "And yet I had not heard of you, an omission I now consider most regrettable." Before she could respond, a voice intruded like a bright thread woven too crudely into fine silk. "Your Highness!" Miss Rosamond Fairlie glided toward them with a practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Dressed in a confection of coral silk and embroidered daisies, she looked as though spring itself had manifested in the form of a determined debutante. Her golden ringlets bounced with every step, and her perfume, overly sweet, clung to the air like ambition. "Papa told me you would be here today," Rosamond chirped, barely nodding toward Helena before placing herself between them like a screen. "Everyone is quite beside themselves about your presence. We are so thrilled you've chosen Bath." "I am pleased to find it as lovely as promised," Leopold said, his voice courteous but cool. Rosamond turned to Helena then, her tone shifting ever so slightly. "Lady Marwood, I didn't realize you were still in town. How very brave of you to be out and about." Helena inclined her head, allowing no reaction to show. "Miss Fairlie." A silence stretched between them, taut and brittle. Prince Leopold turned to Helena once more. "May I hope that you attend the musical at Lady Tinsley's tomorrow evening?" Helena blinked. An invitation from a prince, in public, in the presence of Bath's most attentive ears. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Rosamond laughed lightly. "Oh, Your Highness, I imagine Lady Marwood prefers a quieter setting. She has endured quite a trying year." Helena felt the blow of the words like a slap cloaked in silk. She did not flinch. "I thank Your Highness for the kind invitation," she said, her voice clear. "But I do not currently receive calls. My circumstances no longer permit the gaiety of such affairs." A pause. Then Leopold, with something like regret in his tone, replied, "That is unfortunate. For the musical, not for yourself. You carry solitude as though it were a crown." And with that, he bowed once more and excused himself, leaving both ladies in stunned silence. Rosamond's smile faltered as she watched him go, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Well," she murmured, "one would almost think he enjoyed your company." Helena did not respond. She sipped the last of her spring water and turned toward the windows. The warmth in her chest had nothing to do with the mineral contents of the drink. Elsewhere in Bath, behind drawn curtains and thick stone walls, a woman of stern jaw and colder disposition sat in her drawing room, sorting through old papers with gloved hands. Dowager Lady Marwood had not aged so much as she had hardened. Her auburn hair had faded to silver at the temples, but her spine remained rigid, her gaze sharper than any blade. Her companion, a solicitor with ink-stained fingers and a nervous tick in his eye, waited as she examined the creased envelope before her. "She's been seen at the pump room," the dowager said without looking up, "and in black silk no less, always one for dramatics." The solicitor nodded. "Shall I proceed with the retrieval?" "Yes. Find the documents, especially the letters." "And if she resists, madam?" Lady Marwood folded the envelope once more and placed it gently in the fire. "She will not," she said. "She has nothing left to resist with." And as the flames curled around the parchment, devouring it inch by inch, she leaned back in her chair and whispered, "If she dares rise again, I will see her buried without a name." But outside, far from her reach, Lady Helena Marwood stood beneath the pale sky of Bath, unaware of the storm already gathering. Her fingers still tingled from the prince's gaze, and though she had declined the invitation, a door had been opened, and behind it, the air had changed. The past had found her. But so perhaps had something else, or someone. The afternoon air carried the scent of rosewater and winter clove as it drifted through the open window of Mrs. Plumwell's parlour. A kettle whistled softly on the small iron stove, and a lace-trimmed cloth covered the tea table where a single setting had been carefully prepared. Lady Helena Marwood sat motionless in a worn, velvet-cushioned chair, her gaze fixed on the steam curling upward from the spout, as though it might carry her somewhere far beyond the narrow walls of her modest lodging. "You cannot spend the rest of your days hidden from music," Mrs. Plumwell said gently, folding a linen napkin and placing it beside the saucer. "Even widows deserve melody." Helena offered no reply. Her fingers, wrapped in ivory gloves that had once belonged to her mother, toyed absently with the edge of her sleeve. "It is not a grand affair," the older woman continued, her voice practical but kind. "Only a private musicale at Lady Tinsley's townhouse. Modest, respectable, safe." She poured the tea with a steady hand. "And His Highness will be there." That drew Helena's eyes. "He asked if you would attend," Mrs. Plumwell added, not unkindly. "He seemed quite hopeful." Hope. A word so foreign to Helena's vocabulary these days that it stung. Why would a prince look twice at a woman in mourning? Helena asked, her voice quiet, almost bitter. A woman whispered about in drawing rooms and dismissed in parlours? Mrs. Plumwell placed the teacup before her and leaned on her cane. Because some men still see with their souls. Helena turned away, not to be rude, but to hide the flicker of emotion in her expression. That evening, in the fading light of late afternoon, Helena opened her trunk and withdrew the only gown she owned that was not black, a dove-grey silk, modest and worn only once before her husband's funeral. It had escaped the reach of the dowager's spite simply because it had been packed away beneath books. She laid it across the bed and hesitated. Her fingers brushed the fabric slowly, as though it might burn her. By 7 o'clock, she stood outside Lady Tinsley's townhouse, a pale silhouette against the gaslit street. The house glowed with warm light from within, and the sound of violin and piano drifted faintly through the tall windows. Her heart beat with quiet violence beneath the fitted bodice of her gown, and a familiar whisper stirred in her mind. "You do not belong here." But she lifted her chin and stepped through the door. Inside, the world was as it had once been. Laughter cloaked in civility, music like spun sugar in the air, and conversations full of veiled daggers and scented praise. The drawing room was decorated in pale blue damask, the chandeliers twinkling with the confidence of old wealth. A dozen pairs of eyes turned at her arrival, some in curiosity, others in cold recognition. Rosamond Fairley was among the first to notice. She stood near the harpsichord, resplendent in a gown of blush silk embroidered with roses, her golden curls arranged with the precision of vanity. A string of pearls hugged her slender neck, and her gloved hands clutched a fan that opened and closed with quiet precision. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly at the sight of Helena, but before Rosamond could approach, another figure emerged from the shadows. Prince Leopold. He was dressed in evening attire of dark velvet, his cravat a study in symmetry, and his presence impossibly assured. The moment he saw Helena, something in his bearing shifted. Less formality, more gravity. He crossed the room in measured steps. "Lady Marwood," he said with a bow so deliberate it drew breath from the crowd. "Your Highness," Helena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am honored you accepted the invitation. I was persuaded." He offered his arm. "Would you care to sit?" She took it. The warmth of his gloved hand against hers was slight, but unmistakable. They moved toward the row of chairs near the musicians, passing whispers that fluttered like lace through the air. Helena tried not to notice. She kept her eyes on the pianist, her back straight, her breath careful. But beside her, Leopold spoke in low tones. "I am told you once played the harp." She looked at him, surprised. "Who told you that?" "A man hears what he listens for." She stared at the keyboard a long moment before replying. "I did, a long time ago. I hope you play again." Before she could answer, the music began. But not even the sweet cadence of the violin could protect her from what came next. Rosamond Fairley approached with the delicacy of a swan and the venom of a scorpion. "Your Highness," she said with a curtsy so deep it bordered on mockery. "Lady Marwood, how very elegant you look this evening. I dare say mourning suits you less with each passing day." Helena's smile was practiced, faint. "Miss Fairley." Rosamond fanned herself and leaned slightly closer, her voice lower now, meant only for Helena's ears. "I imagine it is a great relief to no longer carry the weight of expectation. Not everyone is meant to bear children, after all." Helena's hand, resting lightly on her lap, curled inward. "I beg your pardon?" she asked, though she knew precisely what had been said. Rosamond continued, all sweetness. "It must be such a comfort, knowing the Marwood name is no longer yours to ruin." Helena froze. She could feel the room around her press in. The air grew thinner. Her mouth tasted of iron and ash. All at once, the silence between movements of the music felt deafening. Without a word, she rose. She did not curtsy. She did not excuse herself. She simply turned and walked from the room. Outside, the night air struck her face like cold water. She moved quickly down the steps, across the pavement, her satin shoes silent against the stone. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. By the time she reached the lodging house, she could no longer breathe properly. Mrs. Plumwell opened the door, startled. "Child, what happened?" But Helena did not answer. She climbed the stairs slowly, dignity hanging by a thread, and entered her room. Only then did she let the pain reach her eyes. She sat at the edge of the bed, unfastening her gloves with shaking fingers. The humiliation had not pierced her pride. It had pierced her hope. A knock came at the door. She froze. Mrs. Plumwell's voice from the landing. "You have a caller." "At this hour?" There was a pause. "It's the prince." Helena's breath caught. She stood, crossed the room, opened the door, and there he was. No guards, no footman, just a man in a dark coat, his hair slightly windblown, his expression unreadable. "Lady Marwood," he said softly, "forgive the intrusion." She shook her head. "You should not have come." "Perhaps not, but I had to." She did not move, did not invite him in, but neither did she close the door. "I'm aware of what was said," he continued, "and I know what it cost you to walk into that room." Her voice trembled. "Why does it matter?" "Because you walked out with your dignity intact." He met her eyes, unflinching. "That is a strength I rarely witness, and one I admire deeply." Helena looked at him, truly looked. There was no pity in his eyes, only something steady, something unspoken. He extended a gloved hand. "I will walk the gardens at sunrise. May I hope for your company?" The silence between them was filled with candlelight and unspent tears. She did not answer with words. She simply nodded once. Then slowly, she closed the door. The morning mist curled along the stone paths like a living thing, brushing the ground with cool fingers as the city of Bath stirred awake beneath a pale lavender sky. Gas lamps flickered their final embers, giving way to the silver light of dawn. The streets, still hushed and glistening from a light frost, bore only the echo of carriage wheels in the distance and the soft fall of leather boots against ancient stone. Lady Helena Marwood descended the steps of Mrs. Plumwell's lodging house just past the hour of 7, wrapped in a pale lavender pelisse that caught the dim light like the wings of a moth. Her gloves were warm from the fire, but her breath left clouds in the air. As she stepped onto the path, she saw him. Prince Leopold of Hesse stood at the edge of the colonnade, near the entrance to the Roman baths, his silhouette etched against the rising sun. He wore a charcoal overcoat with a high collar and deep cuffs, his gloved hands clasped behind his back in quiet patience. The wind teased a strand of chestnut hair from beneath his hat. He turned as he sensed her approach. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and calm. Helena offered a polite nod. "It is cold." "It is," he agreed, "but the quiet is worth it." She hesitated for a moment, then stepped beside him. Together, they walked toward the ancient heart of the city, past Corinthian columns and statues weathered by centuries, until the stone mouth of the baths welcomed them with its familiar breath of warmth and steam. The interior glowed in amber tones, the water reflecting soft ripples across the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers. The scent was earthy, mineral, time-worn, and oddly comforting. Their footsteps echoed gently as they descended toward the great pool, where steam rose in graceful coils. They paused beside the water. "I used to come here often," Helena said, her voice distant. "When I was first married, it was the one place I could breathe." Leopold glanced at her, not interrupting. "I was told marriage would give me security, purpose, place." She laughed quietly, without mirth. "Instead, it gave me silence. My husband spoke to me as one speaks to a servant, when he did speak at all." Leopold's brow furrowed, but he remained still. "I remember once," she continued, her eyes fixed on the water, "he gave me a garnet brooch on my birthday. It was beautiful. I thanked him, and he said it was what my mother suggested. I assume it's adequate." She paused. "That was the last gift I ever received from him." The silence between them lengthened, filled only by the soft splash of a drop falling from a distant stone ledge. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words came with no weight of pity, only gravity. "I don't want your pity, Your Highness. I offer none, only understanding." She turned to him then, searching his expression. His steel blue eyes met hers without flinching. "I envy your quiet," he said. "You carry it like a shield. Mine is different. The silence I endure is carved by protocol and expectations. From the moment I could walk, I was told what I must become, whom I must marry, how I must breathe." Helena tilted her head slightly. "You're a prince." "Yes," he smiled faintly. "And yet sometimes I feel more like an object on display than a man." Their eyes held for a moment longer than custom allowed. "Do you ever wish you could run?" she asked softly. He looked down at the pool, watching the light ripple across its surface. "Every day." They walked in silence for several minutes, the intimacy of their confessions hanging between them like a fragile ribbon. There was no need for embellishment. The ruins themselves bore witness to all that had been broken and survived. At the far edge of the baths, Helena paused beside a crumbling wall where moss had crept into the grooves of forgotten Latin. She ran her gloved hand gently over the cold stone. "Does it frighten you," she asked, "to be seen with me?" "No, you should be." He faced her fully. "You mistake me, Lady Marwood. I fear many things: failure, dishonor, the weight of a crown I do not yet wear, but I do not fear you." Something shifted in her chest. "I fear," he added slowly, "what you make me feel." She stepped back, just slightly, her breath trembling. Her hand dropped from the stone. "I should go. I'll walk you back." She shook her head. "No, please, not today." He accepted her decision with a graceful nod, but his eyes never left hers. As she turned to leave, he called softly, "May I write to you?" She hesitated only a moment. Then, without turning, she said, "If you must." And with that, she vanished into the rising light. Later that afternoon, the bell above the door of the lodging house rang with its usual brittle chime, announcing the arrival of post. Mrs. Plumwell sorted the mail with practiced hands, placing each letter into the carved walnut holder by the stair. But one envelope, thick and marked with unfamiliar wax, she did not leave unattended. She knocked gently on Helena's door. "There's something you should see," she said when Helena appeared. Seated in the parlor, with the curtains drawn against the pale winter light, Helena unfolded the letter slowly. Her eyes moved across the page, at first with confusion, then with growing clarity. It was a legal document, an account from her late husband's solicitor, a record of sale of her dowry, to settle outstanding obligations owed by the Marwood estate, the line read. "By order of the Dowager." Helena's hands grew cold. "He sold it," she murmured, "all of it, without telling me." Mrs. Plumwell nodded gravely. "To a merchant family in Wiltshire, paid a fraction of its value. It was all arranged weeks after your husband's death." Helena's mouth felt dry. "But I was told—" "You were told what suited them," Mrs. Plumwell said gently. Helena read the rest in silence. The final paragraph struck hardest. "Per agreement, Lady Helena Marwood is to remain without claim or inheritance. This exclusion is predicated on the failure to produce an heir and the presumed condition of infertility, as documented by the family physician." "But I was never examined," Helena whispered. Mrs. Plumwell sat beside her, placing a warm hand over hers. "Because they never intended to question it. You were made the scapegoat before you even had the chance to speak." A silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. Then Helena folded the letter carefully, pressed it flat, and stood. "They took everything," she said. Mrs. Plumwell looked up. "What will you do?" Helena's voice was quiet, but certain. "I will not let them take what little is left of me." That same evening, in a chamber shrouded in velvet and candle smoke, the Dowager Lady Marwood sat at a writing desk, her spine as straight as the lines of ink she penned across parchment. The flames from the hearth cast long shadows across her sharp features. Her spectacles rested low on her nose, and her lips pursed as she reread the document she had just completed. A new clause, one written in the secret codicil of her son's will, a clause that, if brought to light, could devastate what little protection Helena might still claim. She folded the page with deliberate care, sealed it with black wax, and handed it to her waiting solicitor. "Deliver this to the magistrate's clerk before the week's end," she said. "Shall I inform the lady?" The dowager's smile was thin and cold. "No, let her feel secure. Let her think she has reclaimed her dignity." She stood, brushing invisible dust from her sleeves. "And when the time is right, I'll remind her how easily it can be taken." And somewhere in the heart of Bath, Helena sat in her small room, the letter still clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on the fire. She did not yet know the storm that gathered beyond her reach. But she felt the weight of something shifting, not fear, resolve. The envelope lay upon the tea table like an accusation. Its creamy weight, embossed with a royal seal, carried the unmistakable hand of Prince Leopold himself. Lady Helena Marwood stared at it, untouched, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her reason. She had not asked for this, and yet the seal remained unbroken. "You must open it, Mrs." Plumwell said gently from across the parlour, her spectacles slipping down her nose as she folded a linen cloth. Helena reached for the letter with hesitant fingers, the parchment cool beneath her gloves. She unfolded it slowly, as one might unfold a memory long buried. The script was unmistakably his, elegant and assured. "Lady Helena, you are cordially invited to the winter ball held at the upper assembly rooms of Bath this coming Thursday evening. It would be my honor to waltz with you under the light of the chandeliers. L. No title, no formalities, just an initial." Helena's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. "Will you go?" Mrs. Plumwell asked softly. "I cannot," Helena whispered. "You know what they'll say, what they'll do." Mrs. Plumwell stood and crossed the room, her hand resting lightly on Helena's shoulder. "And yet he asked you, in writing." 3 days later, the small bedroom smelled faintly of lavender soap and starch. Candlelight flickered across the pale, dove-grey gown laid carefully across the coverlet, its high waistline and long sleeves whispering of modest elegance. Mrs. Plumwell adjusted the hem for the 3rd time, muttering about stitches and salt. Helena stood at the mirror, her hair pinned in a low chignon with a few loose curls brushing her neck. Her gloves were ivory, her shoes soft satin. Around her neck she wore no jewels, only a single ribbon, pale blue, tied with care. "You look like yourself," Mrs. Plumwell said with a warm firmness. "I no longer know who that is." Then tonight, find her again. At 8:30, the hired carriage pulled up before the great white facade of the assembly rooms. Dozens of lanterns glowed in the night, casting amber halos on the steps where society's finest ascended in jewels, silk, and ambition. Helena stepped down alone. Inside, the ballroom unfolded like a dream wrapped in candlelight and violins. The scent of beeswax and perfume mingled with the hum of gossip and expectation. At the top of the stairs, a steward announced her name. Lady Helena Marwood. The music stilled, just for a moment. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-motion. Helena descended with measured grace, her spine straight, her face unreadable. At the foot of the stairs, a dozen gazes swept over her like the blade of a knife. She walked past them, one breath at a time, her steps guided not by confidence but resolve. She had not come to beg forgiveness. She had come to be seen. Among the gathering near the refreshment table stood Rosamond Fairley, resplendent in a gown of rose-pink silk that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her golden curls were adorned with pearl combs, and a diamond pendant glittered at her throat. The sight of Helena in grey was all it took to narrow her eyes. "She truly has no shame," Rosamond murmured to her companion, a young viscountess draped in gauze. "To appear here, unaccompanied, in such colourless attire, it's no wonder the Marwoods discarded her." The viscountess gasped softly. "I heard she was barren." "Oh, my dear," Rosamond whispered, her voice a blade wrapped in satin. "That is the least of her deficiencies." Across the room, Helena stood near a tall window, feigning interest in the view. Her pulse thundered behind her ears. The gown clung to her shoulders like borrowed courage. Every glance sliced like glass, every breath tasted of fear. Then she heard it. A shift in the music, a murmur through the crowd, and then the unmistakable resonance of his voice. "Lady Helena." She turned slowly. Prince Leopold stood before her, tall and composed, dressed in a midnight blue coat with silver embroidery. His cravat was fastened with a sapphire pin, and his gloves, were immaculate white. All around them the whispers turned to silence. He bowed. "May I have this waltz?" Helena hesitated. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes pressing upon her back. Among them, the dowagers, the daughters, the social guardians of the realm. She could feel Rosamond's stare like fire on her neck, but Leopold extended his hand, not as a command, but as a request. And so, with the breath of the room held tight between chandeliers, Helena placed her gloved hand in his. The orchestra began to play. The music rose like a question, and together they stepped into the center of the floor. It was not the most graceful waltz, nor the most intricate, but it was the most watched. Every swirl of her skirt, every lift of his arm was a defiance, a statement, a story. And in that moment, the world grew distant. Helena's heart beat in time with the strings, not fast, but sure. Her cheeks held no rouge, yet color bloomed beneath her skin. She did not smile, but her eyes held something fierce. Leopold said nothing. He did not need to. Every glance between them was a confession, every step a promise. And when the music slowed, the final chord lingering like the sigh of a held breath, he held her gaze, as though it were the only thing tethering him to the earth. The crowd erupted in polite applause, but no one moved. It was Rosamond, who finally broke the spell. With a forced laugh, she turned to her companions and whispered something sharp, but even she could not hide the tremble in her voice. Helena lowered her hand from Leopold's and stepped back. He bowed again. "Thank you for the honor." "It was mine," she replied, her voice low. She turned then, retreating into the crowd, not fleeing, not this time, but reclaiming something that had been stolen. At the edge of the ballroom she paused. For just a moment, she allowed herself to look back. And there he stood, still watching her, not as a prince, but as a man who had found something rare and dared to reach for it. The morning after the ball unfolded beneath a slate-colored sky, the clouds resting low above the rooftops of Bath like a heavy velvet curtain. The city murmured beneath the weight of whispers born the night before. Whispers of a prince who had waltzed with a disgraced widow, of a woman in dove-grey silk who had not flinched beneath 1,000 judging eyes. Inside the modest lodging-house on Pulteney Street, the coals in the hearth still glowed from the dawn fire, and the air smelled faintly of tea and linen. Helena sat at her writing desk, her posture straight, her hair pinned with delicate care. Before her lay a folded piece of parchment, blank. She had dipped her pen into ink 3 times, and yet not a single word had touched the page. Her mind was not quiet, nor was it in turmoil. It stood somewhere in the aching space between, where memory and resolve wrestled in silence. She wore a simple wool day dress of ash blue, with a shawl drawn around her shoulders. The remnants of last night's boldness still lingered in the air, but they were fragile, delicate as breath on glass. And then an abrupt knock at the door, firm, impatient. She turned. Mrs. Plumwell's voice rose from below. "Helena, dear, there is a visitor." The hesitation in her voice was rare. Helena rose slowly and descended the stairs with practiced calm. At the bottom, standing in the entryway like a dark omen, was the Dowager Lady Marwood. She wore a walking cloak of deep plum, trimmed with sable, and a bonnet fastened tightly beneath her chin. Her cane, though more ceremonial than necessary, struck the floor sharply with every movement, like punctuation at the end of judgment. Mrs. Plumwell lingered awkwardly behind her, eyes wide with unease. "I will speak with her privately," the Dowager announced without turning her head. Helena gave Mrs. Plumwell a silent nod of reassurance. When the door to the parlor closed behind them, the Dowager wasted no time. "You have no comprehension of what you've done," she hissed. Helena's voice was steady. "Good morning to you, madam. You think a waltz changes your place in this world?" The Dowager's eyes narrowed. "You think parading yourself in borrowed silk beside a prince gives you license to be reborn?" "I do not answer to you," Helena replied. "You answer to the truth." The Dowager's voice dropped to a hiss, eyes gleaming with calculated venom. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a sealed envelope. "And the truth, Lady Marwood, is that you were never the victim. My son, may he rest in peace, was a good man." Helena said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on the envelope. "You failed him," the dowager continued. "You failed to give him an heir. You failed to honor his name. And yet you present yourself in society as though you were the wounded party." She stepped forward and placed the envelope on the tea table between them like a blade. "These are letters, private letters, written during your marriage, correspondence between my son and his physician." Helena's throat tightened. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. "The world does not know what is written here," the dowager said. "But if you continue to entertain Prince Leopold's attention, I will have no choice but to deliver them to the Bath Chronicle and to the prince himself." "And what do they say?" Helena asked, her voice low, tight. The dowager smiled without warmth. "They say that he was not the one at fault, that it was you who could not—" But Helena raised a hand, silencing her. "I never saw a physician," she said. "Not once. He would not allow it. He told me the fault was mine without proof. And you accepted it because you knew it to be true." "No." Helena's eyes lifted, calm but burning. "I accepted it because I had no voice in that house." Silence thickened between them. The dowager's fingers tightened around her cane. "You will end this farce with the prince. You will send word declining any further invitations, and you will disappear, quietly, with dignity. If not for your sake, then for his." And Helena stepped forward. Her face was still, her tone even, but her voice carried the weight of something long buried. "You speak of dignity as if you know it, but you sold mine for silence. You bartered my dowry to erase your debts. You cast me out and let society devour what was left of my name. And now, when someone finally sees me not as a ruin, but as a woman, you come to silence me again." The dowager's face darkened. "I have protected the Marwood name for 4 decades. I will not see it dragged through scandal by a baron." "I was never baron," Helena interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. "I was married to a man who despised touch, who flinched at affection, who drank to numb himself and blamed me for every wound he could not confess." The older woman blinked, startled. Helena stepped closer, her breath steady, her hands calm. "Leave your letters," she said coldly. "Publish them if you dare. Let the world read the words of a man who could not face the truth of his own weakness." Lady Marwood stared at her in stunned silence. Then, with trembling fury, she reached for the envelope, but Helena's hand was faster. "I will keep them," Helena said, "as a record, not of my shame, but of his." The dowager's lips thinned. Her pride trembled at the edge of her composure. "You will regret this." "No," Helena replied softly. "I already have, and now I am finished." The dowager turned with a flourish of skirts, her cane striking the floor as she stormed out. The door slammed behind her, leaving silence in her wake. That evening, Helena sat by the fire in her room. The envelope rested on her lap, heavy with its unspoken confessions. She stared at it for a long time, her fingers brushing its sealed edge, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of rage and release. Then, slowly, she opened it. The letters inside were cold, precise. Written in her late husband's hand, each line confirming what she had long suspected but never dared to name. He had lied. He had known. He had condemned her in silence because it was easier than confronting his own truth. The final letter bore his signature, his last words, not to her but to the physician, not regret, not love, only strategy. Let her believe the fault is hers. She will not question it. Women never do. Helena's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she did not cry. She folded the letter, rose, and fed it to the fire. The flames devoured it slowly, the ink curled and cracked, the paper blackened, turned to ash, and with it she burned every word that had once defined her, every falsehood, every silence. When the fire had finished, she sat again, not broken, not afraid, but free. The morning sun rose over Bath with a peculiar sharpness, casting long, decisive shadows across the cobbled streets, as if the city itself had awoken to judgment. In tea shops and tailors' parlours, under the colonnades and behind lace-trimmed windows, the same name passed from lips scented with scandal: Helena Marwood. But this time, the whispers were not born of pity. They dripped with disbelief, outrage, envy. For on that very morning, Prince Leopold of Hesse, heir to a principality most could not place on a map, but whose bloodline was spoken of with reverence, had declared publicly, clearly without apology, his intent to court Lady Helena Marwood. The words had been spoken not behind closed doors, not in hushed tones, but at the breakfast table of Lord and Lady Calthorpe, where a gathering of Bath's most esteemed and meddlesome had assembled. And when the Duchess of Wexley, in her usual brittle charm, had made a snide remark about certain fallen ladies, Leopold had lifted his teacup with elegance and said, "Then I suppose I must count myself fortunate to have fallen with her." Gasps followed, a dropped spoon, and silence. By noon, it was in every drawing-room. By 2, it had reached Rosamond Fairlie. She tore the ribbon from her hair in fury. "She is no one!" she cried to her father, her voice shrill. "She is ruined! She is forgotten! She is infertile!" Sir Edgar Fairlie, a man of polished boots and unpolished morals, poured himself another glass of port and frowned at his daughter's tantrum. "Rosamond," he said coolly, "one does not scream at royalty. One outmaneuvers it." She paused, breathing hard. "I will not be outshone by that woman," he finished, "who now has the prince's attention." She stared at him, desperate. "Do something." Sir Edgar sipped his port, and then with a sigh, he reached for his coat. At 4:30, a hired carriage pulled up to Pulteney Street, and Sir Edgar descended with the ease of a man who had spent a lifetime stepping over boundaries. Helena greeted him in the parlour with composed civility, though her spine was drawn taut as a bowstring. "I must assume this is not a social call," she said. "Indeed not," he replied, smiling with the serenity of a man convinced of his own cleverness. "It is a call for clarity." "Speak plainly, Sir Edgar." "Then allow me to be frank." He removed a folded document from his inner coat pocket and laid it on the tea table. A modest settlement. Discreet, generous, and absolute. All yours, should you agree to withdraw from His Highness's company, quietly, without scandal. Helena looked at the paper, then back at the man. "And if I refuse?" He shrugged. "Then I fear for your future, and his. You presume he cannot withstand public outrage? I presume no one, not even a prince, is immune to the slow erosion of reputation." Helena's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. Sir Edgar leaned forward. "Miss Fairlie is willing. She is unblemished. She has no enemies. And she will not awaken in the middle of the night, wondering if the man beside her has lost a kingdom for her sake." At that, Helena stood. "Take your offer, Sir Edgar," she said, voice low, "and walk out with it. Pride, my lady," he warned, "is a luxury you cannot afford. Love," she replied, "is something you cannot buy." He paused only a second before lifting the paper and tucking it back into his coat. "I hope you do not regret your decision." "I already have," she said. "And I survived it." That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the windows of Bath glowed with candlelight, Helena sat at her writing desk once more. But this time the page did not remain blank. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, each word a stone laid upon the road she had no wish to walk, but knew she must. "My dearest Leopold, what we have shared is not a dream. It is more real than anything I have ever known. But it is not enough, not if it will cost you your name, your legacy, your place in a world that was never built to make room for someone like me. I have spent too many years silenced by others. I will not be the silence that erases you. Forgive me. Forgive me for leaving, but I cannot stay, not and watch you fall for the sake of lifting me. You gave me back my voice. I use it now to say goodbye. And if fate is kind, may it bring us together again in a world where love is not a battle. H. She folded the letter with care, sealed it with trembling hands, and tied it with a single ribbon, the same pale blue one she had worn at the ball. Then, from her neck, she removed the small silver locket. Inside was no portrait, no hair, no inscription, only a pressed violet, dried but intact. She placed it beside the letter. Before dawn, Helena dressed in silence. a traveling cloak, a bonnet, gloves. Nothing beautiful, nothing memorable. Mrs. Plumwell waited by the door, eyes red, voice quiet. "Are you certain?" "No," Helena whispered, "but it is right." They embraced. Neither woman spoke of farewells. The carriage stood waiting beneath a pale, weeping sky. The driver tipped his hat. Helena climbed in without looking back. And as the wheels turned slowly down the street, toward the edge of the city, the room she left behind held only the scent of lavender and paper. On the writing desk, where the ink had barely dried, sat the letter, and beside it the locket, waiting, still, unclaimed, as if the heart it once guarded had chosen to beat freely even at the cost of breaking. The wind howled through the narrow lanes of the Bristol coast, dragging with it the scent of seaweed, smoke and rain. Clouds gathered above like bruises smeared across the sky, heavy with the promise of a storm. Yet in the modest cottage perched near the craggy cliffs, it was not the sky that trembled. It was the heart of a woman who had chosen to disappear. Lady Helena Marwood sat by the hearth in silence, wrapped in a faded wool shawl, her eyes fixed on the crackling fire. Her hair, once carefully styled, was now swept into a loose knot, a few tendrils curling against her cheek. Her gown bore the signs of wear, but there was still a quiet dignity in her posture, one forged not by fashion, but by endurance. Weeks had passed since she had left Bath, weeks since she had written that letter and placed her locket beside it like a final offering. She now lived under the roof of Mrs. Plumwell's cousin, a kind widow named Edith, who asked few questions and offered even fewer opinions. In that house of coastal winds and sparse conversation, Helena found the bitter comfort of anonymity. No one knew her name. No one whispered behind teacups. No one looked at her as though she were a stain upon silk. And yet, despite the safety, peace remained elusive. She had made the only choice she believed was left to her, but she could not forget the way he had looked at her across the ballroom, as though she were not a ruin, but a revelation. The knock came just before the storm broke, firm, measured, as if made by someone who had stood in the rain far longer than pride allowed. Helena rose slowly. She crossed the small parlor, her heart pounding in a rhythm that belonged to another life. She opened the door, and there he stood, Prince Leopold, hair wind-swept, shoulders soaked beneath a dark traveling cloak, his eyes storm-lit and unflinching. Helena inhaled sharply. "You shouldn't be here," she said, the words trembling from her lips. "I have been searching for you for 23 days, he said, his voice raw, the accent heavier now with exhaustion. "And I would have searched 23 more if that was what it took." She stepped back, but only slightly. The scent of rain clung to him, mingled with something warm, something that reminded her of candlelight and regret. "You risked everything," she whispered. "Why?" He stepped inside without waiting for permission, not out of arrogance, but out of desperation. "Because," he said, eyes locked on hers, "you are the only person who has ever seen me. You're a prince," she answered bitterly. "The world sees you every day." "No," he replied. "They see what I represent, what they want, what they can claim. But you, Helena, you never bowed to me. You never chased me. You challenged me. You looked at me as though I were not a prize, but a person." She turned from him, unable to hold his gaze. He followed. "Do you truly believe," he continued, voice lower now, steadier, "that I could return to the life I had before you, that I could waltz with the daughters of ambitious men, smile politely while they measured my value by my crown?" Her back remained to him. "You were right to leave," he added, "if your only measure was safety. But if it was love you ran from, then I must ask, why punish both of us?" At that, Helena spun. Her eyes glistened, but her expression was fierce. "Because love cannot protect you from consequence," she said. "It cannot feed a kingdom, nor silence scandal. It cannot rewrite a name once it has been dragged through every street and drawing room. I don't need it to do any of those things." "And what of your inheritance?" she demanded. "Your title? Your place in your country's future? What will you be if you choose me?" He took a single step closer. "I will be yours." Her breath caught, but she was not done. "You don't know," she said softly. what it is to be erased, to be blamed for what your body cannot give, to be told you are unworthy not because of your actions, but your nature. He said nothing, sensing that silence now was more sacred than speech. She sat down, her hands trembling. "My husband was never gentle," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He touched me like a chore, like a punishment. And when no child came, he told the world it was my fault, that I was broken." Leopold's eyes darkened, not with judgment, but with sorrow. "And I believed him," she continued, her voice cracking. "For years, I believed him." Leopold knelt before her, his gloves damp against her skirts. "Helena," he said, his voice threaded with reverence, "you are not broken. You are the strongest woman I have ever known." She turned her face from him, ashamed of the tears that slid silently down her cheeks. He reached for her hand, gently removing her glove, one finger at a time as though undressing a memory. Her skin was cold, but it shivered beneath his touch. "I don't want your pity," she whispered. "I offer none," he said. "Only truth." Their eyes met then, hers brimming, his unflinching, and with that gaze, 1,000 doubts dissolved. Slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He withdrew a small velvet box, rain-dampened at the corners, and opened it. Inside lay a ring of modest gold, set with a single opal. No diamonds, no emblems, just light caught in stone. "I do not ask for a wedding to silence the whispers," he said. "I ask because I cannot imagine my life without your voice in it." Helena looked at the ring, at him, at her trembling hand in his. And then, with tears that no longer shamed her, she nodded. Yes. The storm outside broke at last, wind rattling the shutters, rain streaking down the glass. But within the quiet cottage, there was peace. Not perfect, not without fear, but real. And in that moment, with no crown, no court, no orchestra, only a man on his knees and a woman with fire in her eyes, they chose each other. The carriage wheels ground softly against the gravel as it turned into Great Pulteney Street. It was a crisp morning in Bath, touched by the bloom of early spring, the kind that dared to awaken hope in the hearts of the weary. From the window, Helena watched the city unveil itself like an old acquaintance, its elegant facades unchanging, yet somehow distant. Every stone, every wrought-iron gate whispered echoes of the scandal she had once fled. But this time, she did not look away. Helena Marwood was no longer the woman who had left Bath beneath the cover of dawn, her heart torn between love and shame. Now, seated across from her in the polished interior of the coach, was Prince Leopold of Hesse, his gloved hand resting lightly atop hers, not as a claim, but as a vow. The return had not been her idea. She had imagined herself vanishing quietly into some remote corner of the countryside, surviving in obscurity, a widow twice buried, once by grief and again by reputation. But Leopold had refused. Not with declarations, not with pleas, but with stillness, with presence, with the unwavering truth in his eyes each time he looked at her. It was not just her company he wanted. It was her return, her name, her dignity restored, not in secret, but beneath the gaze of all who had once turned their backs. The carriage drew to a halt in front of the Assembly Gardens, where invitations had circulated for weeks about the season's first grand garden fete. Helena exhaled slowly. Every part of her, from the curve of her shoulders to the arch of her brow, had been trained to anticipate rejection. But today, she wore lavender silk, not mourning black. Silver gloves covered hands that once trembled with uncertainty, and upon her head no veil, only a simple straw bonnet adorned with violet ribbon tied firmly beneath her chin, as if to say, "I do not cower." Leopold descended first, then turned, offering his hand. As she stepped down, Helena felt the hush ripple through the crowd gathered near the gates. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Fans stilled. Even the soft rustle of skirts seemed to pause as eyes turned, some wide with astonishment, others narrowed with disdain. But Leopold did not flinch. With deliberate calm, he placed Helena's hand on his arm and guided her through the arch of flowering trellises, past curious onlookers and wilting courtesies. And Helena, for the first time in her life, did not feel like a subject of speculation. She felt visible. They strolled the length of the manicured lawn, where parasols bloomed like pastel petals and whispers gathered like pollen on the breeze. Rosamund Fairley stood beneath a cherry tree, flanked by two laughing companions. She wore a confection of rose tulle, her golden curls arranged with ruthless precision. The sight of Helena on Leopold's arm cracked her composure like ice beneath sunlight. "Oh, she does return," Rosamund murmured, lips curling into a smile far too sharp for its sweetness. "What a pity. I had hoped she would fade into the provinces like a proper ghost." But Helena did not acknowledge her. She turned toward a group of ladies who had once crossed the street to avoid her shadow. Some gave tentative nods. One even smiled. The world, it seemed, had not forgotten her entirely. It had merely been waiting to see whether she would rise or vanish. They reached the central lawn, where an orchestra played a stately minuet and tables were arranged beneath linen tents. Helena stood beside Leopold, his presence like a bastion against the tide. She spoke little, but her posture, straight, serene, spoke volumes. No apology lingered in her eyes. No fear stained her cheeks. And then the moment came. Rosamund stepped forward, a crystal flute in hand, her expression fixed in that brittle civility reserved for duels conducted in daylight. "Your Highness," she said sweetly, curtsying with flair, "how lovely to see you, and your guest." Helena met her eyes, calm as still water. "I believe we've met, Miss Fairley," she said, her voice gentle, almost tender, though not in recent memory. Rosamund blinked, surprised. This was not the same Helena she had tried to destroy with whispers and insinuations. There was no desperation in her now, only an implacable grace that made Rosamund's practiced beauty feel gaudy, her poise rehearsed. "Some wounds," Helena added softly, "do not fester in silence. They heal, and in healing they reveal who caused them." It was not a threat. It was not even an accusation. It was truth, and it landed with the weight of an entire season's worth of scandal. Around them the air grew taut. Rosamund paled. Leopold inclined his head but said nothing. The silence was its own verdict. Moments later, Rosamund retreated into the crowd. By evening's end, it would be known that she had left the fete early, alone, without farewell. Days later, it would be whispered she had departed Bath altogether, her father citing a prolonged visit to cousins in Edinburgh. And as for Dowager Lady Marwood, her reckoning came quietly. 2 days after Helena's return, a sealed letter reached every household that had once hosted Lady Marwood for tea, every matron who had once joined her in condemning Helena's name. Inside were transcripts of the solicitor's testimony, proof of funds exchanged, and most damning of all, medical records concealed for years, revealing the truth of her son's infertility. No confrontation followed, no apology was issued. Lady Marwood simply vanished from society, her townhouse shuttered, her carriages sold. She had wagered everything on silence, and Helena had returned with her voice intact. That Sunday, beneath the scent of lilacs and lemon cakes, Helena stood once more in the garden where she had once been erased by whispers. But now the murmurs were different. She heard her name not as scandal, but as curiosity, admiration, even in hushed tones, respect. "Who would have thought?" one matron whispered. "The widow, walking beside a prince. She carries herself like nobility," another observed, "and yet she has no title, only dignity." Helena smiled faintly at the murmurs. She did not need titles. She did not need permission to exist. As the orchestra struck a soft waltz, Leopold turned to her. "Would you?" he asked, eyes warm with quiet pride. She placed her gloved hand in his without hesitation. Together they stepped onto the lawn, and as they moved with slow, deliberate grace, the crowd parted, not in protest, but in reverence. Lavender silk shimmered in the afternoon light. Silver gloves glinted with each turn, and Helena Marwood, once dismissed, once sold, once silenced, danced at the center of a garden that had once exiled her. She did not dance for forgiveness. She danced because she had nothing left to hide. She danced because she had returned. And this time she would not leave. The village of Abbottsley lay nestled among the soft green folds of the Dorset countryside, a place so untouched by time that it seemed to breathe in slower rhythm than the rest of England. Wildflowers lined the footpaths, stone cottages stood with ivy-draped walls, and the air was perfumed by honeysuckle and wood smoke. It was here, far from the clamour of courts and scandal, that Helena Marwood was to be wed. The chapel was not grand. It had no stained glass to boast of, no organ that roared with thunder. Its roof was patched with moss, and its bell swung gently from an old oak beam. But the moment Helena stepped through its arched doorway, her breath caught, not from awe, but from peace. A handful of villagers gathered in the pews, quietly curious. There were no dukes, no duchesses, no foreign dignitaries or endless procession of carriages, just those who mattered, and that was enough. Inside, candles flickered in wrought iron holders. The altar was dressed in wild roses, their scent soft and nostalgic. The spring sun poured through the high window above the chancel, casting golden light over the simple stone floor. Helena stood at the back of the chapel, her hands trembling slightly around the bouquet of violets and white lilies that Mrs. Plumwell had tied with a lavender ribbon that morning. She wore no tiara, no silk imported from Paris. Her gown was of soft ivory muslin, stitched by the hands of village women who whispered as they sewed, moved by the honor of it. The sleeves hugged her arms gently. The bodice was modest, the skirt unadorned. But when she walked, the fabric moved like breath, simple, honest, unpretending. As the chapel door opened and the breeze rustled the ivy outside, the music began. A single violin, played by a local girl, filled the air with tender, imperfect notes. And Helena, with slow, steady steps, began her walk down the aisle. There was no one to give her away, no father, no brother, but she needed no escort. She walked forward as a woman who had suffered, endured, and chosen her own future. Leopold stood at the altar in a dark blue morning coat, his cravat fastened with a simple pearl pin. Gone were the gold braids of court, the insignias of a prince. Today, he was only a man who had nearly lost her. A man who had waited, searched, and fought not for a crown, but for her heart. When their eyes met, the world dissolved into silence. Helena's breath hitched, not from fear, from the weight of emotion that pressed behind her ribs like sunlight behind clouds. Leopold's gaze was steady. No triumph, no pride, only love, fierce, quiet, unwavering. The ceremony was brief, as all true vows are. The vicar's voice was worn with age, but warm with kindness. "Do you, Helena Marwood, take this man?" "I do," she answered before the question could finish. "And do you, Leopold of Hesse?" "I do," he replied, eyes never leaving hers. When they exchanged rings, plain gold bands warmed by each other's palms, neither spoke of promises they could not keep. There were no oaths of eternity, no vows of perfection, only whispered words shared beneath breath that only they could hear. "I will not rescue you," Helena murmured, tears trembling at her lashes, "because you never needed saving, but I will walk with you as your equal until our steps fail. And I," Leopold whispered back, "will not place you on a pedestal nor bury you in shadow. I will choose you, every day." When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, there was no thunderous applause, just a long, still moment where the candle flames danced higher and the roses on the altar seemed to sigh with relief. Afterward, there was no grand banquet. Instead, Mrs. Plumwell laid out a small table in the garden behind the parsonage. Tea, shortbread, strawberries and cream served on mismatched china. The villagers toasted with cider. Children plucked daisies to braid into Helena's hair. No one mentioned titles or lands or dynasties. They spoke of weather, of lambs just born, of the sweetness of the cake. As dusk fell and the golden light mellowed into rose, Helena and Leopold slipped away. No carriage, no trumpets. Just the sound of gravel beneath their boots and the wind playing in the heather. They walked in silence toward the cliffs of Lyme Regis. The sea stretched before them, roaring in low cadence, as if honoring them with its ancient song. Below, the waves lapped against the stones in endless rhythm. The wind tugged gently at Helena's skirts, lifting them like wings. Her veil had been removed after the ceremony, and her hair, once tightly pinned, now spilled softly over her shoulders. Leopold stood behind her, his hands resting on the railing of the overlook, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly, not turning. He shook his head. "Not the scandal? The inheritance? The crown?" He looked at her then, and in his eyes was no doubt. "What use is a throne to a man who sleeps alone?" Helena turned to face him. Her cheeks were touched by the salt wind, her eyes luminous with unshed tears. "You could have chosen anyone," she said. "Someone untouched by shame, someone pure." "I did choose someone pure," he replied, brushing his knuckles against her cheek. "Pure in courage, in truth, in defiance." She leaned into his touch, not with surrender, but with trust. For a long time they stood there, hands entwined, shoulders brushing, breaths rising and falling as one. The gulls cried overhead, and the sea reached endlessly before them, untamed and indifferent to titles or gossip. They did not speak of heirs. They did not speak of legacies or lands. They spoke of the house they would build, of gardens with lavender and thyme, of a study with 2 chairs and shelves of books, of breakfasts taken barefoot, of winters spent by the fire. The future was no longer a punishment to endure. It was a life to be lived together. As twilight deepened, Leopold pressed his lips to her forehead, a kiss of devotion, not possession. And Helena Marwood, no longer widow, no longer scandal, no longer shadow, closed her eyes and breathed in the salt of the sea, the warmth of his presence, and the quiet triumph of having chosen not only to survive, but to love, not as a means of escape, but as her greatest act of defiance. The house stood where wild roses grew thick against the stone, their scent stronger in the heat of late June. It had been built just as she had dreamed, modest, sun-warmed, with ivy climbing over its windows and a low wall that overlooked the Dorset cliffs. From the edge of the garden, one could still hear the sea, not in thunderous roars, but in soft, rhythmic sighs, like the breath of something ancient and forgiving. Helena stood at the doorway, her hands dusted with flour, her apron damp from the washing she'd hung an hour ago. She no longer wore mourning or silk or anything that bore the weight of a past life. Her hair was pinned back loosely, touched now by threads of silver near the temples. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes only made her beauty more profound, as if her spirit had finally written itself upon her skin. Inside, the clatter of footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. "Papa! Papa!" cried a boy's voice, high and urgent. "I saw him first," came another, breathless and laughing. Helena smiled and stepped aside just in time to avoid being swept into a collision of limbs and shouts. 2 boys barreled through the hall, one with Leopold's storm-grey eyes, the other with Helena's honey-brown curls. 8 and 6, they were as wild as the wind that swept the coast. Behind them toddled a third, a girl no older than 3, holding a wooden duck and dragging her blanket behind her like a queen in procession. Leopold entered last, arms outstretched as all 3 children hurled themselves toward him. Time had changed him too. His hair was nearly silver at the temples, his shoulders broader, his steps slower, but the light in his eyes had never dimmed. He kissed each child, whispered something that made them giggle, then looked up, his gaze locking with Helena's. It was the same look he had given her at the altar. "I've missed you," she said quietly, brushing her hands on her apron. "I was gone 3 days," he replied, walking toward her. "That's 3 days too long," she whispered, and his arms were around her before the words had even settled in the air. 8 years had passed, and still they held one another as if the world might take them again. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock, Helena and Leopold sat in the garden beneath a canopy of stars. The sea murmured softly below, and the roses nodded in the breeze. Between them sat an open book and 2 half-finished glasses of wine. "Do you regret it?" Helena asked, her voice quiet, as if she had never asked before. Leopold turned to her, brows drawn with affection. "Which part?" "The crown, your inheritance, all you gave up," He shook his head. "I didn't give it up," he said. "I traded it." "For what?" He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "For the only life worth living." They fell into a silence made of shared memories. The nights they had read poetry by candlelight. The afternoons spent mending garden fences together. The winters when all they had was firelight and the weight of one another's presence. The births, one joyful, one terrifying, one unexpected. The letters from Bath they never answered, the noble invitations they declined, the world they had shut out so they could build one of their own. Not all was perfect. Rosamund Fairley had married poorly, a baron twice her age who squandered her dowry on gambling and scandal. She was last seen wintering in Vienna, alone, her name absent from polite conversation. Her beauty, once her greatest weapon, had become brittle, worn by disappointment. Dowager Lady Marwood had never returned to society. After the public exposure of her misdeeds, she withdrew to the north, shunned by both the aristocracy and her own servants. Helena never received another word from her, not a letter, not a request for forgiveness, and she had never sent one in return. Society had changed slowly, and then all at once, whispers faded, new scandals emerged, and with them, new rules. More women dared to remarry, to reclaim their names, to speak in salons, not just of embroidery and tea, but of law, of rights, of life beyond dependency. Helena's name had once been a cautionary tale. Now it was spoken with a strange reverence, though she neither sought fame nor welcomed it. As the stars wheeled above them and the scent of earth and lavender rose into the night, Helena closed her eyes and let her head rest on Leopold's shoulder. They had lost a great deal, reputation, inheritance, position. But they had gained something rarer than all of that: peace. Love that did not burn but glowed, and a life that neither crown nor court could tarnish. The sea continued its patient song below, and above the cliffs, where once only ghosts had walked, laughter would rise again at dawn, small, wild voices carried by the wind, the children of a woman once discarded, and the prince who chose her anyway. Some stories leave us breathless, others quietly changed. Helena's journey began with loss, shame, and silence, but it did not end there. She chose courage when the world demanded obedience. She chose truth over appearances. And when she believed herself most unloved, she became unforgettable. This tale reminds us that dignity is louder than gossip, and that love, when born of shared wounds and mutual respect, is not just redemptive, it is revolutionary. If Helena's story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Tell us what moved you most, or simply write the word reborn, so we'll know you stayed with her until the very end. We read every message, and it means more than you know. If you'd like to help us continue bringing these heartfelt period dramas to life, you can leave us super thanks with any amount you feel inspired to give. Your generosity keeps these stories alive, scene by scene, word by word. And if you can't give in that way right now, that's perfectly okay. Sharing this video with a friend or loved one who enjoys emotional historical romances is a beautiful way to support what we do. For more tales just like this, full of resilience, passion, and second chances, watch the stories I've linked here in the video cards. They're waiting for you, with candlelight, ballrooms, and stolen glances. Thank you for walking every step of this journey with us. May you never forget, you are not what others say you are what you choose to become.